All right, welcome back to part two of the digestive system. Let's go ahead and pick up where we left off, and we're going to talk about the pancreas. So now we're taking kind of a little side trip from the digestive tract. Basically, what we find out is that we've been talking so far about the gastrointestinal tract or the GI tract. There's also in your digestive system what are called accessory organs. And like your salivary glands happen to be an accessory organ. And the reason why we call them that is because they're not actually something that food passes through, but there's something that like secretes something into the digestive tract. The pancreas is very similar to them. It's a gland. No food actually goes through it, so it's not part of the GI tract, but it plays an extremely vital role. So I think like the pancreas is like um, it's like the hidden star of the digestive system. The thing about the pancreas that's cool is that a lot of people, if you ask them like which organ does most of your digestion of your food, they would say, oh, your stomach. Like you swallow your food, it goes down the esophagus, it gets digested in your stomach, blah blah blah, whatever. It turns out that most of the digestion happens in the small intestine because of the pancreas. And that's why the pancreas is such a vital organ to you. So if you look at the pancreas, it's like kind of long and skinny, shaped kind of like a tail, they say. And in fact, they call this part the tail of the pancreas, and they call this part up here the head. But it's hooked into just below your stomach, so it's just inferior to the stomach, in the very first part of your intestine. And so, just as food's leaving through the pyloric sphincter from the stomach, it's getting bombarded by the pancreas and all of its secretions. And this is where most of your digestion actually takes place. So, there's a little fact you can share with people. But anyway, the pancreas, like I said, it's just posterior and inferior to the stomach. It's connected to the duodenum or the duodenum. You can pronounce it either way, which is the first segment of the small intestine by this thing called the pancreatic duct. So that's what they're showing you here, going right through the middle of it. And the pancreatic duct allows it to dump all of its secretions into the small intestine. It contains these things called acini, which are the exocrine part. So if you remember way back in our endocrine system study of the pancreas, we said that it was like 99% exocrine and 1% endocrine. So the 1% were the pancreatic islets, the other 99% are these acini. And if you look at this illustration, you can see here's all these little acini. There's like a whole bunch of like exocrine cells that are all lining this tubule that goes down into the pancreatic duct. And over here's the pancreatic islet in kind of like the midst of all these. Anyway, the acini produce this stuff called pancreatic juice. And by the way, I did not name any of these things. I'm sorry, they're pretty gross. I think using juice to describe this is terrible. But pancreatic juice is this substance made by the pancreas full of digestive enzymes. And it has a pH slightly in the alkaline region. So it's 7.1 to 8.2. And the reason for this is it produces a whole bunch of bicarbonate ions as well to neutralize your stomach acid. So as soon as this acidic chyme is coming out of your stomach, the pancreas is going to like turn it back into like a pretty neutral substance so it doesn't burn your intestines, which is pretty cool. So let's take a look at pancreatic juice. Pancreatic juice contains basically an enzyme to break down everything you eat. So it has enzymes to break down carbs. It has enzymes to break down proteins, lipids, and nucleic acids. So basically, they say you are what you eat. You have all those things in you because you're getting them from your food. So we have this stuff called pancreatic amylase, which is going to break down carbs. Trypsin, chymotrypsin, and carboxypeptidase are all going to break down protein. So you can see like we got tons of protein destroyers here. We have pancreatic lipase, which is going to break down your lipids into the fatty acids. And we even have ribonuclease and deoxyribonuclease to turn your DNA and RNA into its nucleotides. So basically, everything that is, because everything you eat is a living thing or was a living thing, you're breaking it down into all those building blocks that you're going to use in your body. Great. Another set of accessory organs are the liver and gallbladder, and they're located very close to the pancreas. So once again, your stomach's located right in about here, and surrounding the stomach, we have the liver, gallbladder, and pancreas. And so when you look at the liver, it's your second largest organ, second only to your skin as far as its total size. It weighs about 3 pounds, the same weight as your brain, but it's even less. What I want to say here, it's like less dense in your brain, so it's a little bit larger. And the gallbladder is tucked right underneath of the liver over here on the right side of your body. You notice the liver also extends a little bit farther down on the right side, stomach's more on your left. Stores bile, which is produced by the liver. So the gallbladder does not produce bile, it just stores it. But it also can form gallstones, which we'll talk about in a minute. And basically, these guys work together to carry bile down into the duodenum or duodenum, however you want to pronounce it. And this is where they're going to use bile. And bile basically is a substance produced by the liver from the breakdown of your blood. If you remember, we talked about in the blood chapter how blood gets broken down, and we have like the heme and the globin, and remember the heme group ended up becoming like bilirubin and all that good stuff. So that's what bile is made from, and it's used to emulsify fats. And if you don't know what that means, emulsifying or emulsification means that you're taking something that's fatty and you're making it broken down to like smaller globules. So think about it this way: like if you had like Italian dressing and you have like the oil part and the water part, and they can't mix. If you add an emulsifying agent to it, it makes it so it's like soluble. So like the oily parts and the watery parts can mix together, and there's like little tiny oil bubbles, but it's like able to be mixed. That's what bile does. And if it wasn't for bile, basically you couldn't digest fats very well. And that would not be good because one, you need fats for a lot of things. And two, and this is really gross, so don't tell anyone I told you this, but if it wasn't for bile, you would like poop out like greasy fecal matter. And that's not good. Funny story. So a bunch of years ago, you know how there's like artificial sweeteners that are sweet, but your body can't break them down, so they have no calories. So like NutraSweet or aspartame is one. Splenda, also known as whatever it's called, is another one. Anyway, they tried to make a non-digestible fat, and they came up with one, and it was called Olestra, and its brand name was called Olean. And they, I think Frito-Lay, I don't know if they made it or they bought the license to use it, and they made chips that were fried in this non-digestible fat. And so basically you could eat these potato chips and they tasted just like regular potato chips, except the fat would not be digested by your body, so it didn't add any calories. So if you ate these chips, they had the same calories as like eating a salty potato or something like that, which sounds great. The problem is that if you ate more than one serving, you could start to accumulate this fat that would go right through your digestive system undigested and cause it to lubricate your colon, which would lead you to like have basically poop come flying out of you. And so they had to put a warning label on these chips that said like, warning, consuming more than like a serving of these chips could lead to like involuntary bowel movements and anal leakage. And that's literally what they had to put on these bags of chips. So needless to say, they didn't sell very well because when you have to write may cause anal leakage on your chips, probably not going to work. Thank you. All right. So the liver does a lot of things. The liver is really important besides making bile. So your liver basically, after food has been digested and gets into your bloodstream, your liver's job is to metabolize it. So it takes all the carbohydrates that you've eaten and it stores their glucose as glycogen. So a lot of your like glycogen is stored there so that you have energy for later in the day. Lipids are kind of hard to break down. Your digestive system absorbs them as fatty acids. Your liver is able to do some really amazing metabolic tricks and turn those fatty acids into straight ATP. And proteins are another thing that's really hard for your body to digest. So your liver has to do a lot of work on them. And it actually takes the proteins, it takes off this NH2 group and turns it into ammonia and eventually urea, which then your body gets rid of through the urinary system. So the proteins are probably the hardest thing for your body to digest, and the liver really has to work hard to make that happen. Anyway, The liver also is involved with getting rid of any sort of toxins or hormones. So think about it. If you take like a pill, let's say you take aspirin as like a painkiller, it doesn't last forever because the liver has to metabolize it out of your system. And so that's why a lot of medications that people take, they'll say, you can't take them if you have a bad liver, or you have to have your liver checked, because eventually everything that you take gets broken down. Same thing like alcohol. If you drink a lot of alcohol, you can get cirrhosis of the liver because the alcohol damages the liver, because it has to work very hard to metabolize and break down those toxins. But it does that for other things too, like any sort of hormone or chemical that's in your body has to get broken down there. Of course, your liver gets rid of bilirubin by secreting as part of bile to break down fats. And your liver stores a lot of stuff for your body too, like vitamins and minerals that come out of your food. It stores it so that you can use them for later. So, very, very important digestive organ. Let me go back for a second. I almost forgot about this with the gallbladder. So the gallbladder stores bile. So basically, if you were to go back and look at the liver and the gallbladder, they're connected by these ducts down here onto the small intestine. And so after you produce bile, any excess bile that your body doesn't need gets sucked back up into your gallbladder to be stored. If let's say that you eat a lot of really fatty food, you have to make a lot of bile and your gallbladder to suck a lot of it up. But what happens is over time is that some cholesterol and some fats get sucked up with this bile as well and stored in the gallbladder. And over time, they can start to solidify and form these like solid cholesterol crystals, which are what become gallstones. And so what they found out is that factors that influence whether you're going to get gallstones or not have to do with your gender. So for some reason, it seems like women tend to get gallstones at a younger age than men do. Genetics, like certain families tend to get gallstones more than others, and your diet matters too. So the more fatty food you eat, the more that the younger you're probably gonna have gallstones. So like if you're a male and it doesn't run in your family and you eat a very low fat diet, you'll probably never have gallstones. But if you're a woman and it runs in your family and you'd like to, eat fast food every so often, there's a good chance you're going to have gallbladder problems. But it's not a lock. Nothing's ever guaranteed. Okay, so moving on to the small intestine. The small intestine is interesting because even though it's called small, it's actually the longest portion of your intestine, but it's smaller in diameter than the large intestine. So the small intestine is only about 1 inch in diameter. It's about 10 feet long. Now, when I do this, I'm saying that in a living body, if you look at cadavers, and if you were to stretch a cadaver's intestine out and like really stretch it as far as you can make it longer than 10 feet. But in the living body, the estimate is about 10 feet in length. So you might see that this is like higher or lower in other places. When you see the small intestine, it's broken down to three regions. The first region, that's about a foot long, is called the duodenum or duodenum. And it gets its name because duo means two, and denum, like I guess, means 10. So it was supposed to be 10 and 2 fingers long. So like 12 fingers long. Because I guess back in the day, they measured everything in fingers. So I guess if you held up all your fingers, like two hands worth, plus two more, you would get this. So I guess basically they're saying it's 12 inches. So that's the first segment. The second segment that's here in this kind of like bluish green is the jejunum, which apparently means empty, because when people die because of its location, I guess in dead bodies, the food would slide either backwards into the duodenum or it would push on into the ileum, and this would usually be found empty. So that's where it got its name from. The ileum is the last segment of the intestine. It's by far the longest. It's 6 feet long. The jejunum was 3 feet. Forgot to mention that. And at the very end of the small intestine is this thing called the ileocecal sphincter, which separates the small intestine from the large intestine. If you look at the inside of the small intestine, it has a lot of folds. It has these things called circular folds. So if you look at it, there's a whole bunch of like wrinkles, kind of like the rugae of the stomach, that folded up. And these are macroscopic. You can actually see these. If you zoom in on these circular folds, you can see that there are villi. There's little finger-like extensions that stick up. These are microscopic. But you can see them, here's a microscope picture, and you can actually see all these little villi or finger-like extensions. And then if you look at the surface of the cells, each cell has kind of like this rough border where it's covered in microvilli. So it's like the cell membrane is folded. So we have folded cells that are folded into villi, And then these villi are folded up into these circular folds. So we have folds on folds on folds. Needless to say, tons of surface area. Here's those lacteals that we were talking about with the lymphatic system, if you were interested in that, that absorb absorb fatty acids. All right, so what does the small intestine do? First thing it does, mechanical digestion. So it continues to mix your food, mix your chyme. And one of the ways it does this is this thing called segmentation, which is what this illustration is showing you over here. So when you swallow food down, it goes in little balls, little boluses. And because the intestine kind of like squeezes it like a tube of toothpaste or a tube of paint, if you can think about that, it's able to squeeze it back and forth and mix it. So it squeezes and it moves up and down and up and down and up and down, and it mixes around until eventually it becomes this homogeneous mixture. This also helps to aid in absorption because it shuffles which part of this is in contact with the outer surface. So by moving it around with these segmentations, those little gurgles that you might hear while you're digesting your food are actually helping to increase how much you can absorb out of it. We also have peristalsis, which is like waves, and these waves start up at your stomach and travel all the way down to the end of the small intestine. They take about 90 to 120 minutes to make it all the way down to the end. So they're very, very slow, but a whole bunch of them go in sequence. So it's like wave after wave after wave after wave. And each wave of peristalsis squeezes the intestine a little bit and pushes the food ahead a little tiny bit so that eventually, after about 3 to 5 hours, all the chyme that you have been working on gets sent down to the large intestine. All right, so the small intestine, it does chemical digestion. So all of your chyme, as it goes into the duodenum, gets mixed in with that pancreatic juice and starts to get broken down. So that's where the digestion actually takes place. Also, more than 90% of your absorption takes place in the small intestine. And so, actually, the way it works is the duodenum is where you're kind of getting the last little bit of digestion. It's continuing a little bit into the jejunum, but the jejunum and the duodenum do a lot of the absorption of food. And then, when everything gets down to the ileum's job in its longest section is to strip the last little bits out so that maybe, by the time you're done with the jejunum, maybe you've absorbed like 60 or 70% of the nutrients. And by the time you get down to the end of the ileum, it gets that last little 20% out to get up to over 90%. So everything from like monosaccharides, amino acids, ions, water, lipids, bile salts, vitamins, all the good stuff are absorbed out. And because all those villi, and circular folds, tons of surface area to do that. All right, the large intestine. Large intestine, way wider, 2.5 inches wide compared to the small intestine, but way shorter. It's about 5 feet long, and it's broken up into 4 different areas. So as food comes out of your ileum, it goes through this thing called the ileocecal sphincter and gets dumped in this region called the cecum. And basically, if you look, the food comes up and gets dumped in here and kind of goes in like a circular motion. This is like a little dead end. The cecum is literally like the cul-de-sac. It's where it kind of goes backwards. And this is where your vermiform appendix is. The appendix is like the bacterial clubhouse where bacteria kind of hang out in case like you should take an antibiotic or if you got diarrhea and start flushing everything out. By the way, vermiform means it's shaped like a worm because it's kind of like its shape and size. But basically, your food comes in and it gets mixed with bacteria as soon as it gets into the cecum. And once it gets mixed in here, it starts to go up through the ascending colon. So it's called the ascending colon because it rises. It goes across the transverse colon that goes across. It goes down the descending colon, which descends down on your left side, goes through the sigmoid colon, which sigmoid means S-shaped, so it's kind of shaped like a letter S. It goes into your rectum, and rectum actually comes from the word rectus, meaning like straight, or meaning like, if you remember, like vertical, and it drops down vertically through the rectum. This is where it's stored until it can be eliminated through the anus. So, interesting little thing about this is that when the food first comes in here, mixes with the bacteria starts to eat your food and starts to turn it into fecal matter. Oh, I forgot to warn you. This is a really gross picture. This is a picture of a section. This is a pathology slide of a section of the large intestine with some polyps. So this thing that looks like a meatball over here is actually a polyp, and this is colon cancer. So if you ever hear about people like having a colonoscopy and they see a polyp or they see some sort of growth, that's what they're looking at. And you can see all those little folds inside of the epithelial layer. Anyway, the rectum is where we store our food or store our fecal matter before it's getting ready to be eliminated. The anal canal is where we actually eliminate all the fecal matter out of us. So, anal canal is a couple different parts. The anus is the actual um, opening. It's the actual hole that the fecal matter drops out of. The anus is surrounded by two anal sphincters, the internal and external anal sphincters. And in case you're wondering why we have two, so when you get fecal matter into your rectum, when you reach a certain level of like stretch inside of the rectum, it sends a signal to your brain that causes your brain to release the internal anal sphincter, which is made of smooth muscle. So it's smooth muscle, you can't control it. So when this opens up, the only thing that's stopping you from defecating immediately is the external anal sphincter, which is made of skeletal muscle. And if you remember, skeletal muscle is voluntary. So when you feel like you're holding it, literally that's because your rectum is full enough that your internal anal sphincter has been opened and you're just holding it in by sheer will at that point. So normally, when you don't have a full rectum, both of these are closed. So you have like a voluntary and an involuntary part that work together. The intestinal wall, if you look at the large intestine, it's very smooth, and that's what this graphic is showing you. It's very smooth compared to the small intestine. It doesn't have any villi. It just mainly absorbs ions and water, which is why if you don't poop soon enough, like let's say you have to poop, but you hold it for a long time, you might notice that your poop is very dry and brick-like. That's what it is. Constipation is where you don't get the food through your colon fast enough, and it comes out really dry. So basically, the longer that you have fecal matter in your large intestine, the drier it is, the faster it goes through, the more liquidy it is. So that's why sometimes you have like a loose stool, for example. And basically, inside of the large intestine, we see that there are bands of smooth muscle that form little pouches that kind of help to mix the food and push it along as it goes through. All right, so why do we have a large intestine? Basically, its job is to move all of this chyme and eventually feces by peristaltic waves all the way through it down to the end. If you ever notice sometimes that you have to go very suddenly, especially right after you eat, there's this thing called mass peristalsis, which is like when you start to eat a big meal, your brain sends signals down to the large intestine saying, hey, I'm getting ready to dump a whole bunch of food on you. You need to clear out. And basically, it causes your large intestine to squeeze and push whatever's inside of it all the way down to your rectum. And that's why suddenly, out of nowhere, you might feel like you have to go. So there you go. We do see that inside of the large intestine, because of the bacteria floral that lives in there, we do see bacterial fermentation where they basically break down whatever you can't eat. So if you get a lot of gas, that's because you ate a lot of food that your body couldn't break down, but the bacteria can. And when the bacteria in there break it down, they release vitamins B and K, which your body absorbs. So you get something out of it. Also, once again, you absorb a lot of water out of there. So once again, like how thick or thin your fecal matter is determined by how long it's inside of your large intestine. And finally, we have this thing called the defecation reflex, which basically means that when your rectum starts to get full, there's pressure from the smooth muscle, which sends a signal to your brain saying that you need to go. And then at that point, the only thing that's stopping is that external anal sphincter. Fantastic. All right, so I just want to show you this real quick. This is just showing you why we find it easier to break down carbs compared to proteins. If you look, if you eat a starch, salivary amylase in your mouth breaks that starch down into disaccharides, and then very quickly when you get into your pancreas, it's going to release all those different like pancreatic enzymes, which are going to break it down to monosaccharides, and it's ready to be absorbed. Versus proteins don't even get started until they get all the way down to your stomach with pepsin. By the time they leave your stomach, there's still large polypeptides, which then have to get broken down into smaller ones in amino acids. And then those amino acids have to go all the way to your liver before they can get broken down. So this is a very long chain. And that's why proteins make you feel fuller longer. And they're harder to digest than carbs. And this is just showing you kind of an overview of everything. So if you want to pause this and read this, this is just showing you an overview of everything that we talked about all the way through the digestive tract. All right, well, that's it. Thanks for listening. Hopefully you guys learned a lot, and I'll catch you next time.